Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again. For those of you who've been with us for the introduction part, I shall repeat myself. Welcome to the third evening of the series, The Quality of City in the year 2017, and the subject is the performativity of the city, emancipation and integration in the urban society. My name is Robert Huber of Zukunftsgeraeusche, which is an office which is located in Munich and Berlin, and we deal with different aspects of Stadtentwicklung, of the development of the city, and also with the culture of building and the heritage of the modern. And we're already here in the third year. I have a little reverb on my ear here. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's better now. Thank you. And we're already allowed in the third year to host the city, the Quality of the City Society in association with the Bauhaus Museum Archive of Design and also the Architectural Chamber of Berlin, in cooperation with the TU Berlin and the Institute of Sociology at the section of Martina Löw. And I'm glad to be able to thank the Federal Agency of Civic Education that also fosters this series today. As I said, we're already here in the third year in the Bauhaus reuse in the building. Let me tell you a couple of words about this building. Yeah, the windows that you actually are able to look through. We draw the curtains in order to keep the warmth in here. These window elements are from the north facade of the famous Bauhaus in Dessau. Bauhaus was built in 1926, and after 50 years, it was renovated from the damages of the war in the times of the GDR. And so these windows are the heritage of the Bauhaus from the year of the 50th anniversary of the Bauhaus. It might already be interested to mention that the Bauhaus-Archiv was founded in 1926. The Bauhaus was founded in 1919. And so for that anniversary, these windows were brought here and they were reused, and where we are right now in the Bauhaus reuse building. So it's a very special building that deals with the heritage of the modern, but it also raises the questions about the history of the building. So what was actually the plan of using light, these windows? It's a very simple building, as you can tell, because it's a little bit cold in here. But it's also reusing all the resources. It's a recycled building, you could actually say. My colleague, Mr. Winter, my partner in my office, who's also present here this evening, and I are always willing to answer questions about that building, should you have any. That's it about this aspect. Okay. Today, this is the third evening in our series, and the title, as I said before, is The Performativity of the City, Emancipation, Integration in the Urban Society. And the performativity of the city, the actual title is Emancipation and the Liberty of the City Air. And of course, let's start with our guests. First of all, the lady here is Marianne Rosenstein. She was a professor for sociology at the University of Frankfurt. She studied sociology in Munich and Berlin. She made her doctorate in 1976. in the section of Habermas at the Max Planck Institute, and from 1979 to 86, she worked scientifically in the office of the Technical University of Berlin for city planning, and her topic was the development of the city since 1750. That shall be only a short introduction. Maybe you could give us a couple of words about yourself and your biography in the discussion that will follow later on. So you're a Berliner by choice. And your roots are not far away from the city, too. And then I want to introduce you to Professor Uwe Wirth. He is a professor for cultural science and New German literature at the University in Gießen. And before that, to 2005 to 2007, he was leading in Berlin an Institute for Cultural Research and New Literature. He also has a socializing here in Berlin, a Berlin background, you could say. That's right. He studied in Heidelberg and Frankfurt am Main, and also in Berkeley in California in the United States. And at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, he made his doctorate and became a professor there. One central subject of his studies is the performativity, and he published an anthology on that. And we also dealt with the Austin lecture of Austin. It's a very good book here. I can recommend that to you. And he dealt with the theory of the space too. And also published on that subject. And all the literature we mentioned you can find here later on. It's also on the internet, all our research. Just check Bauhaus-Archiv.de, just to give you a little hint. Well, I would like to share a couple of words on the subject of this evening before I hand over to the word to Mr. Wirth, who's going to share a little, as we call it, impulse lecture on the subject of this evening. We're going to talk about that later on all together. And also there's going to be another introductory lecture by Ms. Rodenstein. There's one thing I want to mention in brief. You might have read in our introduction to this evening that Ms. Fischer-Lichter was invited to this evening, which is maybe the expert on performativity. Unfortunately, I have to tell you that she cannot be here this evening for personal reasons. This comes as on short notice. Unfortunately, we don't have her with us this evening. Well, first, let's go back in brief to the subject of this evening. You might have read the introductory text, but let me tell you still, today's subject, the performativity of the city, emancipation, and the liberty of the city air, is our subject right now. And what's so special about it, this, unlike the last year where we dealt with topics between architecture and the planning of the city, that today we used to deal with the development of the urban society like in a seminar. It's very unusual for a discussion evening like this, but we find this a very interesting experiment to deal with the subject in that way. So, let's say all the questions that come up here we needn't answer today. Let's focus on our central subjects, and you're kindly invited to join us again in our next evenings, in our next lectures, to deal with that subject more in detail and in depth. Well, the question is emancipation in the frame of self-constitution of the urban society. Is that a motivation of people actually joining the city? Is that a key of success for integration as a permanent process of the building of society? Do you define yourself as an urban person? Well, it is a theory that the city as such attracts people not only from today's emancipatory perspective, and it goes all back to the medieval saying Stadtluft macht frei, which translates as the city air makes you free, literally. And of course, we're talking about economic reasons here that contributes to the attractiveness of the city. If you want to come up or better your personal circumstances in a financial way, the city attracted you. So these shall be the questions we deal with. The performativity, which also means redefining yourself as a person because you gained freedom, liberty in the city as a frame. We're going to hear about that more later on by Frau Rodenstein, Ms. Rodenstein. And the question is it today is it a reality that you are actually free today? Was that promise of the city air makes you free fulfilled? And we're beyond all that legal aspects or what kind of minority you might belong to. For us, it's we deal with that on an everyday life basis. Well, we said there's one aspect of constituting a society through itself, by itself, within that given frame. We have heard about that in the last evenings. We're talking about roles. It can be an obstacle, or in the worst case, it can be actually a factor that excludes people from the city society. We have heard in our introduction how that term came into existence. And this term itself constitutes a performative system where freedom is not only connected with and within this frame, everybody finds himself, this exclusion, this inclusion, and this brings us back to the discussion of the term of performativity. Okay, let's talk about our role of society, and let's hand over the word to Mr. Wirtz, a lecture which I'm very much looking forward to hearing. Thank you so much. Just a second there. I'm in a difficult age. I need glasses here. Okay, I'm trying to do three things at the same time here. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a great building. It was just worth for the building as such to come here. I was trying, based on the title, Performativity of the City, Emancipation, and the Liberty of the City Air, which comes with a question mark, actually. Based on that, I'm trying to come up with a couple of thoughts. I would dealt with the term of performance, but I'm definitely not a sociologist. I have no clue about the city as such, and let's see how we get from here. This is when cultural scientists try to bring terms together and connect them. Well, the title, Performativity, Emancipation, and the Liberty of the City Air, question mark, constitutes a connection between, first of all, the big and a little nebulous term of performativity and the striving for emancipation that in the age of enlightenment took place, and also the stage where actually this striving for emancipation is performed. The city, for example. And everybody knows that term, city era makes free. And Max Weber, when he dealt with economy, was thinking about the early stages of the 19th century and the breaking of the so-called Herrenrecht, which means the right of the ruler. So the city era makes you free from the nastiest aspects of the feudal ruler, because the peasants had to work for the rulers. That was their kind of tax. And you wouldn't have to do that as a citizen of the city. And often peasants fled from the countryside in order to get rid of that urge to work for their feudal rulers. And if you stayed in the city for a year and one day, you were actually free. And literally, in that very sense, after 366 years, you were free breathing the city air. And of course, the feudal rulers did not like that. And if you fled to the city, you were actually a tax evaders. So between these citizens of the city, there were a lot of conflicts with the feudal rulers, also violent conflicts. In other words, the motto "Stadtluft city air makes free" was really controversial. It was very political in the 19th century too. And even if I talk about this only briefly, that it means entering the city was part of an emancipatory act. If you went to the city in order to become free, then what you do is you declare your independency. So the city air makes free actually means the change of the country air to the city air made yourself free. Well, on the countryside, the feudal rulers made all the laws, whereas the society of the city constituted their own rules. And according to Weber, there is another aspect that made you free. In the city, different to the countryside, there is what you had on the countryside. People knew each other. So in the city, there is anonymity. That's a new quality of the city society. And the bigger the city, of course, the more likely it is that people do not know each other. So there is a lack of connections between your neighbors. City air makes free because city air makes you anonymous. And Georg Simmel wrote about his essay on city and the minds of the city, that people on the countryside dealt with also free, dealt more with fright about each other's plans. But when you entered the city, the individual gains a possibility of movement apart from the jealousy that initially comes with moving to the city and meeting other people. So this emancipation of the individual that gets rid of the ties of their jealous neighbors by moving to the cities, this individual is enabled to different cities. So the unpersonality constitutes a form of over-personality, and thus society comes into being. There's a dialectics of intellectual distance and liberty. So Stadtluft nach frei, city air makes free, is modulated by applying it to the small city and the big city. So today, the person in the big city is free as opposed to the small city person where you're tied. And of course, the price for this freedom is in the big city that people do not tend to care about their neighbors. What actually you might gain is a small aversion against your neighbor, but this also contributes to the independent freedom of the individual. This freedom, according to Simmel, comes up as soon as you hit the city, because everybody's crammed together, and therefore you have to gain a little anonymity and your distance within these boundaries of being close together. And Weber characterizes this as the typical city life. You have this small aversion, as I said, and therefore you need this distance to your fellow city man, so to speak. Parallel to what I said about the Declaration of Independence that I mentioned before, that you do by entering the city, there's an act of abstraction, which is also a liberating factor. Abstrare in Latin means making yourself free, getting rid of something. In this case, making free of strong individual ties within a country, society. Well, in the city, people who don't know each other can live next to each other, and this also is a basis of the urban society. And there is an architectural aspect to it. And I said, quote, and the buildings crystallize unpersonality so that the person cannot hold up against it, actually. End of quote. Well, the concrete quote, buildings of the city are a stone-made principle, and the principle of a mind that has become depersonalized from his kin. And it's also a motor of an unpersonal life, which is also liberating and alienating at the very same time. So society is also formed by this anonymity, by this unpersonal net of people. So there's an ambivalent aspect to it. So a city enables people who don't know each other to live next to each other. There is an essay also with the title, Stadtluft macht frei, City Air makes free. And the author says the city lives from problems and the solving of these problems and the parallelity of next to each other, with each other, against each other, for each other. This actually brings into being, this very ambivalence brings into being a strong tie of the society as self. The city is a social form, and here's a longer quote by Becker, the author. There is more consequently, empty gaps that are not yet defined are closed by the city. Gaps that are yet to be defined. The question is, who do you meet, for what reason, or do not meet for whatever reason? And this is only possible if the room is not that defined. We have open spaces, public spaces that are the very basis, and you can actually compare it to cult spaces before. You only knew something was going to happen, but these decisions are yet to be made in these very spaces. End of quote. This description brings an aspect into the center of the focus. So there's three aspects of possibility spaces in cities. First of all, people who don't know each other can form ties and hierarchies and powers. And second of all, because you have these spaces that can be filled with a certain function. And third of all, the city defines these spaces in a prominent way, and it's actually the arena where these ties can be formed. But is it really the city that forms these things, or is it more the discussion about the city that constitutes these things? The city as such is seen in the essay as an anonymous room. Desato, I quote, constructs that. There's a functional empty gap that allows, I quote, that allows a game of defined spaces in order to define other spaces in that very system. So the city, as much as the discussion of the city makes way for spaces, for possibilities, for options. Now it gets time to introduce you to a term which is very prominent in this evening, the performativity. Well, let me just give you a few small definitions and about the functions, going back to Weber, Simmel, and Becker, who I just mentioned here. Well, you can be excused if you don't know what this word performativity means. John Austin says, performative speaking acts, Austin wrote, it's a new word, it's a nasty word even. And maybe it doesn't even have a great meaning whatsoever. But there's one thing that speaks for this word, because it doesn't sound deep, profound. There's a lot of ways in which you can use that term performativity, and there's an ambiguity, and that actually contributed to the success of this nasty word, as I called it before. Well, if you ask me what does what does this term mean, you have linguists, you have scientists dealing with theater, and they all give you different definitions. Austin himself dealt with performativity in a way, dealing with Wittgenstein, where by saying something you actually perform an act, and hence the act of speaking theory. For example, if you get married, you have different acts of speaking. You say yes in front of the altar, in front of the priest, who then says, I hereby declare you husband and wife. And where you perform these speaking acts is also important. There's several constitutional speaking acts. There is a provocation in speaking acts, so much, but there is actually terms on how these speaking acts can succeed, as opposed to, for example, is it right or is it wrong? But performative speaking acts actually do not describe facts, but they make facts, give birth to facts, because they introduce you to sequences of acting. For example, when the husband and wife promises to stick to each other in good times and bad times, then by saying so, and the priest saying, I hereby declare you husband and wife, then you actually are in the status of being married. So I told you about, you have to know about the circumstances in which the speaking acts are done. And it's not only intentional, it's only conventional, and it's also functional. And we're talking about the honest intention. Husband and wife have to actually mean it honestly, to stick to each other in good times and bad times. And there's a social determinants in a conventional and functional aspect. Let me quote Austin. So what you mean and want when being married is not a very personal thing. It's not an individual thing. So you could actually say there is an institutional frame around the act of being married, for example. So individual intentions in a speaking act are transformed to a frame of institutional circumstances. So there is the basis of a successful speaking act, There has to be accepted conventional procedure with the result that's expected. So certain pieces have to say certain words under circumstances, and the people that we're talking about here have to be the right people for that speaking act. So they have to be authorized. For example, only the priest can declare your husband and wife. If somebody else does it, like the cleaning person, then it's not valid. As opposed to this functional aspect, there is a phenomenal aspect to it. So performance, when we're thinking about Noam Chomsky and his way of dealing grammar, he differentiates between competence and performance to tell you about the knowledge of the actual speaker in an actual situation. And we're not only dealing with the subject, what's beyond what you can actually see, the conventional function of the speaking act, but also this is subject under which these utterances can give birth to a new reality. So what's implicated here, what is implied here, you have to have an interested view where you want to implore what the circumstances are in written form, gestures, or facts in order to describe circumstances. And there is ways of performing. Michel Certeau dealt about it when he talked about the act of speaking. The act of walking is for the urban system what the act of speaking is for saying and meaning something. So, for the city, the walking person is as important as the saying for the acting person. Why? Because you realize certain spaces, you constitute a space by walking through it. And you take that room, you make it your own. For example, everybody knows the term of no-go areas, and you cannot constitute these places by walking through them. So this is a performative way of moving through spaces, moving through the city. And in English, you have the term of performance, and this way of using is in the center of theater science, which is no surprise. And Erika Fischer-Lichte, in her essay, dealt with performance, and she has 4 aspects. First of all, performance is a way of constituting something of somebody who's present, of what he does. And second, in production, you constitute things. And third of all, it also depends on the material that you deal with. And fourth, perception. The audience is important. It's dealt with his perspective as well. Performativity not only deals in her essay, not only with what you say and how you say it, but also with the success in the frame of theater, for example. You not only have a performance on stage, but also in bodies, for example, when celebrities get married, when politicians congregate, or when you constitute a new parliament. And there's also a staging of things. And as I said before, there is also an aspect of performance when you walk through the city, when you walk through the park in order to show yourself a citizen of the city. And maybe you want to be recognized by the very few people you know there. And today's society has a very strong aspect of staging, of performing. Fischer Lichte wrote about it's fueled actually by this culture of performance. So you could say that there is a network of performative speaking acts that go through all aspects of our life: institutional, authorization, personal. That is all important for our network of living together. For example, just the traffic rules. If the red light is on, if the green light is on. Also for contracts, if you're a tenant, or if you want to do like your kebab stand, you also have these rules. And naturally, we also deal about big questions. For example, institution of marriage, should that also be applicable to couples of the same sex? So all these acts have a taste of performance to it. But also the buildings as such, where these acts are performed, are a valid part of that. For example, let's say about police, or the body of where trials are held, where important decisions are made when you actually break the rules of a society. All these buildings not only embody these bodies of constitution, but also constitute a stage, you could actually say. Dirk Becker says, the city constitutes the spaces where decisions are made. At the same time, where speaking acts are made, they are also stages. Something is actually staged when you say this thing. Let's stick to the example of getting married. For example, let's talk about the staircase when you, before you enter the building. If there, for example, is a couple of the same sex, then the very staircase of these buildings where the marriage is held becomes a stage. If you follow Meredith Judith Butler, then there is a tension between the speaking and staging, because your body as such forms the possibility what you can do, which has a frame of the constitutions, of the rules of our society. So the body as such is a constitutional body. Concluding, you could actually say, city air makes performative, you could say. And in three aspects: first of all, in the function of meaning; second of all, in the performance practices, and where it is performed. Well, how do you describe performance and the performative act in its relationship? Is one following the other, or is performance and performative act has that relationship that is filled with tension? Let's go back to the marriage. If you are married by the person who is in charge of that, it is valid. And if there is a marriage of a couple of the very same sexes, if it's regulated by the law, if it's allowed, it's valid. But if it's against the law, it's not valid. At the same time, if you're on the stage in the theater, if the priest is only played by an actor, then this is not valid. Then you're not married. Why? Because the people who say, I will, and the person who says, I hereby declare you man and wife, is not able to say these words and actually meaning that. You don't have the power as an actor on stage to make it come true. You don't have the legitimation you actually need. But of course you could come from the other side with your argument and say there is a show side to each and every speaking act. For example, if the couple, they might actually give it a try at home before they go to the church, and then they remind themselves and act like actors because they've done it before at home. And that's a very interesting question. There's a poem, a performance with a staging character. If you apply that to the city, how do these spaces of options, of possibilities come into existence? How can we establish these optional spaces that we are allowed to define later on? When we're talking about the empty space, when it comes to the city, we think of empty spaces where you could actually come up with a new building or have architects filling that building. But empty space is what is meant here is a possibility, is an option, not only in the space of the city, but also as an option, as a possibility. And this all contributes to the city. Simmel and Weber said, one important aspect is that you have to live together with people you don't know, that there is a lack of social bindings between you and your kin. So how can we apply this aspect to performativity? We talked about city life versus country life before that. On the country, of course, there was a feudal ruler, and these were also performative regimes. The regime of the feudal ruler made sure by its very own interest that you stuck to those rules. Whereas now the city society also defines its own rules, also as opposed to the feudal rulers. For example, there's a term of autokephalie, which could translate as self. You can only be judged by by the judges of the city. In this way, we're independent too. And hereby, the change from the city, from the countryside to the city, is a change of regime. First of all, the feudal regime loses its power over you, and the other gains its power above you just by entering the city. So Desartaux made this analogy between entering the city and the Declaration of Independence. Okay, let's talk about the function of the city. City area makes free because people who don't know each other live next to each other. Therefore, we need certain rules that are independent of the individual. And performative acts of speaking organize intentionality and define what you can mean, what you can want above an individual independent will. There is a template where everybody fits in, that this basis, that this frame applies to. So when people who don't know each other live together in the city, you do need these performative acts of speaking, because who listens to you has to know what you say when you say something. So we have a common language here. So I come to the third aspect, and this predictability, this accountability is actually questioned again. Well, of course, you could say if the staging of a performative act of speaking, there is another aspect. This is only a side aspect. A completely different thing is when you make it clear that not what you say is important, but the staging of what you say is important. So the performative acts of speaking are lifted of the burden of their consequences. And of course, we could talk about what is needed for the success of these acts of speaking. And political aspects can apply there. So we can renegotiate actually these acts of speaking. Well, the city air, which makes so free, is that not based on an ambiguity? The tension between performative act and performance itself? I would say yes, because this very tension opens up freedom and enables us to think anew about conditions of successful acts of speaking. And the function of the city, if you ask me, is not only that people who don't know each other can live together, but also initializing ambivalence options that enable us to fill these freedoms. City air makes free because city air makes ambivalent. You could also say city air only exists because it enables ambivalent options and statuses. That was it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we have actually a script of your speech so I can read it again. That was very interesting. Thank you so much. You said to bring it all together in a compact way, and you really succeeded in that. Let me have a little look at the clock. What time is it? Are there any questions? Keep them in mind, and let's continue straight away with our second lecture of Ms. Rodenstein, which sheds a different view on the very same subject. Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes free. I'm glad, and thank you so much. Here's your microphone, madam. Well, first of all, a few things you have heard before from a rather different perspective, though. And I'm really interested in discussing the differences with you. Well, individual and emancipation of the society, of the persons, and the liberties that the city gives you are strongly connected. But how they are entwined, that was different in different eras. And I have 3 big steps to show you this history of emancipation up to the 19th century. And then later on, I shall talk about how it is today. And then again, I bring up the term of performativity. First of all, what is emancipation? What does that mean? It's Latin, as you can clearly hear. It means as much as a slave becomes free from his master. Of course, today we use it in a different way. We say it's a process of getting free of bindings, of legal ties. If you apply it to today, you love that term, right? And this term, I'm not so very happy with it because it implies that you can develop yourself. It's never the case. The constitution of the self is actually what's meant here. You always need other people. Nobody can develop all by itself. But just how you are connected with other people develops and changes over the years. Let me start with making yourself free of feudal rulership and Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes free. Let me start with the era of founding of the city between 1000 and the 14th century, almost all people lived on the countryside way back then and were born into being dependent on the rulers, maybe peasants where you had to pay taxes, or if you were slaves, you had to work for your ruler. If you want to win over people for the city life, you had to free these people from the bindings of this feudal rulership. The Kaiser, the emperor, came up with his own regulations that only in the 19th century were historians in the 19th century only it was comprised into the Zentren Stadtluft macht freie city or makes free. And I was wondering why in the 19th century this subject became important again. We shall see that in a little while. What did that mean in the medieval times? When you succeeded as a peasant, as a country person, to flee to the city, and as was mentioned before, if you lived there for a year and a day without being caught by the ruler and their men, you were free of these ties. You were allowed to stay in the city. You could get married and also have children, and the children were free and did not have to carry the burden as if you had been born on the countryside. Which didn't really mean that you had the special freedoms of a city person. You were a refugee from the countryside, but you were truly welcome in the cities because in the countryside more people died than that were born, so they needed an influx of people. There were a lot of epidemics, and there was a rather big risk of an untimely death in the cities. Well, as we know today, the sewage was a problem, and there was a lot of germs that were actually and toxins in your drinking water. And in 1232, it was the freedom of the city was limited because the feudal rulers gained more powers as opposed to the Kaiser, the emperor. But the city still needed the influx of people from the countryside. Let me move on to the second step here. In the early era of Enlightenment and Reformation, by rediscovering the knowledge of the antiques, first of all in Italy, it was a big change and the rise of education. The first universities in Germany were founded, which became a magnet of attraction in the city. Luther, too, taught in Wittenberg at the university that was founded in the early 16th century when he wrote a famous essay about the freedom of a city person, which can be seen as a call for freedom to each man and women, as opposed of the power of the Catholic Church, who limited actually your approach to God to the priest. You always had to approach to your Lord through the priest. But the cities who decided then to become Protestant, and from the Netherlands and from France, the wars started to wage in the 16th and 17th century between the Christian religions, the Protestants and Catholics. A lot of people fled. Also, these Protestants fled to Berlin. And these refugees were truly welcome because they were very good handyman, and they gave rise to the wealth of the city. The refugees didn't have to fear of losing their life. But for example, in Frankfurt, a Lutheran Protestant city, you were not able to build your own churches, to perform your religion, and also your status, your rights were limited if you were of a different religion. The third step was done with the Age of Enlightenment. People were not supposed to take the limitations and the frame by a godly power, but constitute it for themselves. And in the French Revolution said, everybody's born with equal rights. Way back then it was understood not for women. During the French Revolution, Olympe de Gouges demanded women should be as free as men, and she was killed for that, actually. France, way back then, was already politically advanced, and England was having a lot of economic success. Germany was far behind economically and politically around 1800. There was a situation of crisis. Prussia, Napoleon was there. Stein and Hardenberg tried to reform society in Prussia and took very important steps that were taken over by other German cities or took place there at the same time. Well, three reforms were important for the cities. First of all, the constitution of self-rulership on a communal basis. Second, you were free to take whatever profession you wanted to take up, as opposed to the medieval ages where it was restricted what job you could actually take. And third of all, the reform of the soil. So you did not inherit your daddy's debt, for example. But it was paid for with a high price. The liberation of the peasants ended in disaster. There was bad harvests, and then they fled to the city where they became simple laborers in the early industrial times. And the cities grew and doubled their size and tripled their size in a chaotic manner. And there was a lot of poverty, and the housing was really poor. And the people who moved to the city, they contributed to the diversity of the city in the late 19th century. There were so many of them, and with them, anonymity grew, and the social control that was typical of a small city declined. Hence, the personal freedom, your personal liberty was fostered through that anonymity. And Simmel described that new liberty of the individual, and you could live your own life according to your own possibility within that frame of the city. And not just because you were anonymous there and there was a lack of social control, but also, well, let me point out that because the cities provided the necessary infrastructure for that. Places for education, universities, and the culture. This freedom of the city, this liberty of the city, which is sometimes paid for by the price of loneliness, was sought by single women who were looking for a chance of living a better life, by artists, by working women. And there were like two groups that are not mentioned by Simmel that were looking for their social emancipation, and they were also important for the evolvement of the city. First of all, the workers, and then the movement, not only of the workers, the movement of the women who were fighting way back then for higher education, for their right to vote, and the right to take whatever profession they wanted to take up. And let me just come back to that. Cities are a place for refugees. They provide protection from persuasion, but they also produce by themselves liberty and freedom because, for a place of emancipation or for gaining higher education. Here I want to make a cut and move on by 100 years and raise the question, how is it today with your individual emancipation and the women's movement? Well, first of all, let me talk about individual emancipation. While Simmel saw a chance for individualization through the city freedom, he saw that positive. You gained new chances, new possibilities in the city. But the view of Ulrich Beck from 1986 focuses on a different aspect of individualization. Here, individualization seems to be a sort of an urge, a tie. He speaks of an individual society where everybody has to take choices. You have to do that. Because all traditional standards that were valid up to the 1970s ceased to be. For example, that where you came from, what family you came from was so important or crucial for what jobs you could have, or that the job you started working in, you will work there until your old age pension, or that the marriage will last a whole lifetime, or you will stay at the very same city for your whole life. Through the change of a working reality, we all need flexibility today, and changes are inherent here. There's countless options here. I heard that at German universities, you have 35,000 topics of studying there. So the choices are vast in big cities. You have to be active yourself in order to explore these options and possibilities. Well, there has to be a large adaptivity to newer circumstances. You have to see it in a way that, well, you have to answer the question, what do I actually want to be? As they say so nicely today, there's a self-optimization need in order to be competitive. And this situation seems to be aggravating still. And Reckwitz speaks of the singularization and means more than self-optimization or being responsible for yourself. It seems to be central today that everybody wants to be unique or unusual. And of course, this is also a paradox expectation of society to you. And this singularization is seen by Reckwitz in a highly qualified middle class. In each aspect of life, you apply the frame of extraordinarily. How you deal with your own body, what friends you have, where do you travel. In the mode of singularization, your life is not just lived, it's curated. The late modern subject performed his special self in front of the others who actually become an audience. Media, we're thinking about the social media, do play an important role here. The subject moves on a market of social attractivity where a fight for visibility actually is staged. Only the unusual can win there. Well, there's a lot of identities that each subject can choose for himself. And it constitutes his own personality in scenes throughout the city. The sociologist Goffman speaks of people as role actors who do not only stage on the big screen, but there's also these small screens where we don't know what's going to happen, but we sense, we think that the actors have to use a lot of powers and cannot hold up their act for the whole time. So, how do we go from there? Just to think about the countless burnouts that we read about today. This aspect of performativity is constituted by the structure, but about the work modes, and is motivated by the need of being socially different. I want to deal with the women's lib movement, the second movement for women's liberation, and I want to talk about an possible evolution of freedom, especially here in the cities. And my example to show this thesis from a sociological aspect, your social sex, how does that evolve from the 60s on? In the 60s and 70s, of course, it depended on the genes. A man had male genes and so on. And the second women's lib movement that started in the 70s saw the man and woman as there's a biological sex as opposed to a social sex. And these two aspects were differentiated, and you called that gender from then on. The social sex of a lady, it was like that and was seen as that. You had certain rights, but also there was the patriarchal rulership of men. And this is why you would not fight with women in that movement. This fight of women with countless performative acts, you could actually say. You wanted equal rights, but we still have not reached that as of yet. In the 1980s, our view on sexes changed from the United States. We saw that the binary sex of a male and a female was also socially founded. There's a great bandwidth of combinations that we see today. Judith Butler in 1989 came up with the conclusion that the sex of man and woman is actually a performative act, can be seen as a performative act, that by a repetition of acts becomes the constitution of the two sexes as we knew them before. Well, when the baby is born and the doctor says, "Oh, it's a girl," and then everybody says, "Okay, it's a girl," and the baby, when it grows up, is socializing as a girl and accepts that too. So that's a performative determination from the very start. And by constant repetition, the sex is actually produced. And she says by subversive acts, we can break up this determination of the binary sexes. This is a great example. I am sorry if I got the name. This one person that with the Eurovision Song Contest performed Conchita Wurst, the participants for Austria. You might remember that. The name doesn't really matter. And that was a subversion here. It was neither man nor female. That was a great example for what I wanted to illustrate here. Well, with this conclusion, Butler took. There is another movement of the queer where people actually do not want to make that difference between the two sexes. And this movement has gained strength and legitimation. The highest German court has by now accepted a so-called third sex. Now you have the third women's movement that deals with all sexes, actually, and does not exclude men anymore, as it used to be. And there's still some thoughts that have been dealt with. Thank you so much. Thank you. While Mr. Wirth is preparing for our next section, let me say something about Ms. Rodenstein. From about 1974, she is active in Munich, in Frankfurt, in women's lib, and she wants to introduce feminist impact and topics in science. And she's working for the Architectural Chamber. She founded FRUPA, a feminist organization of city planners and architects. Just to give you a little background, to show you what an expert she is in these subjects. Thank you so much for these two impulse lectures. They were almost filling the evening. We have 5 minutes for a little discussion. And then we open the panel for our audience so you can ask your questions, ladies and gentlemen. Well, there's one aspect I want to deal with. A question to you now. We talked a lot about Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes free. We mentioned that a couple of times. And there seemed to be a little contradiction. I don't want to deal with the subject of self-constitution, even though I found that interesting too. After that, you spoke about self-optimization, this quantified me, as you also call it. And the question is, why do people do that? Well, the answer is because it's possible. People do that because they can. Well, you might say I'm wrong, but I think you mentioned that motivation behind it. Well, of course, you can make a little fun of it and say it's a sort of an ersatz for a lack of meaning. But is there not also, you said, a constitution of yourself, or the self-constitution? Is that not the ultimative self-constitution of yourself? Would you contradict me on that? No, of course, naturally. Your own persona, your own person is challenged more and more to make decisions. You cannot just lean back and say, oh yeah, I made my decision. But you also have to claim what you want to be. And if you ask me if I think of a Simmel, maybe it's a little exaggerated, but I see successful not necessity, but urge to just hit the stage as a self-performer and to pretend to be able to gain everything, achieve everything, and to excel in every aspect. There's so many examples. And of course, you demand too much for yourself. We mentioned burnout aspect before. Well, I don't know how far you can actually push this. I don't see this as more freedom that we gain. I would rather mention the aspect of breaking up of these two sexes determination. Also, when it comes to laws, I see that as more freedom that we gain, and certain groups in our society profit from that and are more widely accepted in our society. Oh, absolutely. I would completely agree with that. Well, you could say everyone's a startup, and must have my USP. I see more like a candle that burns faster. You might say that's something you want to go for, but when we're talking about the third sex acceptance, which you reminded us of, it's more like stepping back and saying, just a sec. I don't want to decide binary, I'm male or female, but I run the risk of taking a third way. Well, of course, there's a contradiction in society that we see. There's two dynamic movements that actually don't seem to match quite. One is celebrated, and the other is seen critically by a large percentage of society. As I said, I wanted to talk about this other aspect. You raised the question, is it right with the city air making you free? Well, way back then, young ladies hit the city, of course, with the wish and the will to determine their own fate. And on the other side, of course, they had the jobs of just being a maid or a servant. Then I was thinking, what else does city air make with you? And I just Googled it, Stadtluft macht arm, city air makes poor, actually. I found an article from the last year. If you move to Munich, well, you run the risk of becoming poorer and poorer. Of course, that's from rags to riches, just the other way around, from riches to rags. Does city air still make free? Or has the risk become very high? Well, if you have money, it's quite okay. You have a nice place to live that you don't have to leave. Then you can enjoy the city thoroughly, lean out of your window. And may I please mention that? Because I knew this history of emancipation over the decades, and I thought, this cannot be the end of it. Where we are today, in no way is this the end of the development, of the evolution. There's a lot of aspects that we have to free ourselves from. Just when you think about how the individual evolves, this urge of self-optimization that we mentioned before, why is that so? Don't we have to think about what is the next big emancipatory step for us? And here I think, well, at least I think it, I see that in a much larger control of the capital. Think of the media, the social media, the internet, and so on. And on these levels, I went to think there's a lot of possible things happening. Are you thinking of an individual emancipation? Oh, no, on society terms. Of course, individual emancipation comes with that. But let's talk about society. You can't separate these two. When you free yourself of ties, the ties of the financial. No, we're talking about ties that we have, things we have to do in our society, and this performative aspects of self-optimization seems to be an urge rather than an option, even if people don't see it in a different way. Well, you wanted to say something to that aspect? I was just thinking how to make ends meet here with these two aspects. From our initial thought of city area makes three free, and the second thought of emancipation. How can we bring these two aspects together? And the city area also can make you poor. Yeah, the economic question is important as well. And I was thinking to myself when I was listening to your lecture, if a lot of these things happening when we're talking about the sexes, is the city as such, as a frame, an important factor? For example, being homosexual in a big city is easy, but do that on the countryside. So you have new freedoms, new liberty in the frame of the city that would not work so well in conservative levels, on a rural level. So the city, that you still have more freedom and option. You have fast internet, for example. That in some places it's the biggest difference. On the city, it's cheap to live, but you can't go on the internet in Germany in many places. So there's a new modulation of these differences between rural and urban areas. So let's rethink today. What makes city air? Sorry, with you. How free does it make? Oh yeah, there was one aspect we had dealt with. Is the society of the city is still the space for the avant-garde, for new developments in society? Or is it not happening more and more on the digital level, on the internet, where you also have the anonymity of the city, and you have a succession of things happening, of perceptions and so on, more in the internet? And another aspect I wanted to mention, we dealt with the stranger, with being strange before in one of our lectures. And that's also a very specific aspect to city life. And you said the deed identifies the stranger, because if you come from a different place, you do things differently. And also that pointed to this evening, where we're talking about not only the act of speaking, but also about the act of doing and how they're brought together and become entwined so much. And for you, from the background of performative aspects, does the deed actually define who's alien? I didn't understand you acoustically. Oh my. I just wanted to come up with that question. And we talked about the city and the country. Well, I did not know that lecture. I'm sorry about that. Well, I thought you saw it on the internet, did you? Let me raise another question. Can we not apply the question you rose to today's subject? What options are there to come up with strategies of acquisition where the strange, the foreign, the alien becomes more familiar? How do cultures achieve that? Is that not a try by means of performative means or deeds, if you wish, to show a diversity that you have so many things different that it's not alien or foreign anymore, that it's just different, it's diverse then? Yes, you could say it is, and there's acts of speaking who just try to deal with that, to negotiate that. And what really excited me when I prepared this evening is the city of the frame. What role does an urban society play? Being strange, is that different in a city? Is it maybe celebrated, or is it the strangeness renegotiated, or does it diminish? Maybe one depends on the other. Well, it's the question again, city and country, the duality of the two. The question is if today the city still gives you the options of successfully renegotiating your personal freedom or the freedom of society. We were not able to answer that question in the last evening. And my personal conclusion was if you live it to the extreme, it might be the commuter who has a home in the two spheres, on the country and in the city. Maybe he lives it to the very extreme. But I cannot give you one final conclusion or answer. You still have that dichotomy between country and the city. Maybe it is today the dichotomy between virtual and real. I wanted to say something about the subject of conflicts. I think your conclusion was with ambivalence. I can't quite recall your very last sentence, but I liked that aspect. City air makes ambivalent. And it makes you poor, as we heard, it makes you free. Indeed, all different kinds of things. But I just thought when you mentioned the Carnival of Cultures, which is a big annual feast here in Berlin, I was thinking about the transgenial Christopher Street Day, which is held here in the surroundings of Karlsberg and Neukölln. It was held annually for 10 years, I think, until last year. It was a fantastic stage by transgender and all kinds of diverse groups. It's a performative act, you could call it, to you make these shows and carnivals to feel a part of your very society, but also show the public who you are. And get them used to seeing these groups. And now it's not possible anymore because one group interfered with that, which is dangerous, if you ask me. I don't know how it actually happened, but it's not done anymore. So these counter forces against these emancipatory aspects of the cities, that are also performative, that stage their powers. You could talk about those as well. Yes, we talked about this before, that this performative staging of things also has its downside. Of course, I can constitute something like more freedom of choice, and so on. And also, just as natural, I can come up with a reactionary countermodel to that. And the question, of course, is, well, which of the two will gain the upper hand? Well, what can we gain, and how long can this stay there? Will it go on from there? Or we were talking about the acts of speaking. Maybe I can ask a question. We've heard the term of post-facting. And by this performative turn, is that not also fostered these aspects? Well, the post-fact, it comes into being because we're all constructivists in a certain way. We can say to everybody, each and everybody, only you see that way. And then finally Trump came up with, hey, well, then there's alternative facts. If we all construct our own reality, well, there you go. It gained its own logic, its own dynamics, if you ask me. Is that not only a failure? Well, it's a very good strategy, to put it that way. The strategy of your fiend to use it against himself, well, it's quite successful strategy. Well, the word performative is used with this little gap because it's something trivial, actually. As we found out also, it's getting interesting when we're thinking about the curating, the performing, like showing something, presenting the show aspect, like in a museum, for example. What interests me also is I got really so interested now in the inherent logic of the urban society. Coming back to curating, well, we have Facebook now to curating ourselves. How do we curate ourselves in the city space under different circumstances? Before that, you could not curate yourself online. You had to walk through the city park to show off your newest clothes. Is there today something like a competition? Is there a virtual city logic that came into existence that, for example, also annihilates the difference between city and country? As we said before, on the countryside there hardly is fast internet here in Germany. Well, these trivial facts are not that trivial anymore, after all, when you think about the infrastructure. Then these questions become virulent. So, is that a question you raise here? Yeah, let me ask a question too. I find that exciting too. Shall I try to come up with an answer as the host of the show? Maybe I can tell you how I see these things. what's always interesting when you reach this point of the virtual is to go back a couple of years where you had things. Remember Second Life, for example? Where when people thought this is a vast market, people are going to use avatars, control them, determine them. And just remember, it did not work quite that well. It was just fashionable for a little while. It's almost like a fashion market. And fashion as such is not on Second Life, and it's still in our real life, and it creates a lot of profit, so you don't have to apply that to the digital worlds as of yet. For example, the media forms like Instagram, you need the physical reality to foster the need of the recipient. For example, these YouTubers making reports on very banal things. How do I go shopping? How do I apply my makeup properly? Like bringing back the shopping bag and unwrapping it. You need the real, you need the reality. You have to generate these photos to post on Instagram. So these are the photos of actual goods. You still do that in a very dense space where you have all these options. We're talking about the city of qualities here. That also Simmer might have meant you have the options and potentials, and you can redistribute them on new media. Well, first of all, the virtual reality. Remember, we're talking about augmented reality. And if I have a look in the media, people who dealt with avatars who move in a virtual world all on themselves. It's in the game scene, but that's just my personal perception of these things, my personal judgment. Just from what I've seen and what I've heard. Let me have a look at our clock and use the option and ask our audience, are there any questions? We've had a lot of input already on this evening. And the term of emancipation of the urban society and Stadt macht frei, city makes free, we saw a lot of different aspects of these terms. Maybe things don't seem so certain anymore as when we started this evening. We can't really come up with a perfect conclusion to the term of performativity here. Is there anybody who has a question here? I saw somebody nodding here. Was that any questions here, or are you just glad about the evening? Microphone. What really surprised me is the pessimist view. We were talking about the pest in the medieval day, and today's city air gives you a burnout. We have to move a step further, and the answers I got later were not that satisfying. Or do we have a different? Do we have a wrong view on the city? We only see it as a space, as a place on the map. Or do we have to see city in more aspects? Also the virtual aspects. From the 90s, when you ask me, the city more and more starts growing on the web. And we have the urban functions there, we have the markets there. We have the education on the net, and also exchange of views. We have social networks. You can see it any way you want, but it is happening. So the performative is not only manifest in the buildings. Yeah, it exists, okay, but it's not what I see as crucial today. It's the other aspects I mentioned. The non-place, so to speak. Oh, it's very plausible and evident. We're preparing this evening as a TV report because it had this very nice word of Freiraum, the free space. Well, in Berlin, for example, we have these extreme left-wingers. You could call it a no-go area where they live, but they say they create free spaces. I found that very interesting. That this term, this concept of a free room, you can see it positive or negative any way you want it. But when you go to Simmel's view or Rebecca's view, it doesn't make a difference if you like it or not. Is the city good or bad? If you're optimistic or pessimistic, it doesn't make any difference. The city's the city. Do you get ill? Do you stay healthy? No, but we're talking about the place where it all happens. And you say that the net is taking over rural functions. And this is my question. You can chat with people you don't know or deal with them. Is that not what the internet does today? And we have like hundreds of malls of Berlin and malls of Frankfurt, but nobody goes there to do his shopping because everybody is shopping online. So the whole idea of having your private space, your city space, we have a parallel structure that fulfills all the functions of the city. But at the end of the day, it makes all these things superfluous that we had before in the city. But the physical aspect is very important. It depends on the bodies, on the humans. And this is also an aspect of performativity, that we make the city our own space by means of our bodies. It's all got a physical aspect here. And we move through the city with our bodies, and we've formulated also a challenge to the city, a demand to the city. The way I understood you is rather negative aspects and sad when it comes to emancipation. This is only certain developments here, and they're not always completely positive or completely negative. They always have both as an option. You can have a failure, but you can also be triumphant in the metropolis, as a book around 1900 put it. And we did not look at the ordinary people. Well, let me add to something you mentioned before, also to the question you rose. Maybe it's only that the marketplaces have moved to the internet, because many of these platforms, so there's platforms for what do I know what, when you try to cash in on them, then they just develop into new ways of distributing goods. Maybe just the markets move out of the city. And your criticism about the malls where hardly any people go shopping. In the United States, you have super malls. And we saw all the historical aspects about the freedom you gained in the city. And maybe this is another step in emancipation. We still remember of open spaces where you wander through parks and you go through the market, and there's still a recourse of our old markets. And still money is invested there, and you try to create a room where it's worth staying. It's not only shopping, but it's always in connection to consumerism. Martina Löw, please, you have a question? Just briefly, a comment on the discussion. I don't think the malls are that empty, actually. What definitely changed is that people don't watch television that more, but they walk through the city with their mobile devices. So there's a revivement of the public. Maybe people don't show off their clothes that much anymore as they used to. There's a new body culture of food. Food has become such an important, crucial subject. Who eats what? Who eats where? Maybe it's just one physical culture turning into another physical culture. You mentioned the empty malls. Yeah, people are in malls, but they all go do their shopping on the internet. They go to the malls, talk to the shop personnel, and then they just try to save 10 euros and buy it on the internet. Or take photos of the goods. You mentioned the physicality of it, the physical aspects. There's one thesis that shared work is a urban principle. Well, you buy your things on the net, and in the city you go eating out, or in the yoga studio. So you go online from here to there. Well, you take your body and show it in the city, but economically, functions of the city have gone to a different infrastructure, to a digital one. There's quite a few people who want to raise questions. Oh, that's great. I think you're only concentrating on one aspect. Well, the internet turns into reality when the goods actually have to reach your address you buy online, or you hope for your neighbors to take your parcel, for example. It's a way of expression of that shows throughout the city. We have a pluralistic society. We have all the differentiation, which is reality in a city, and each of these groups has the wishes of using that room, of making that urban spaces their own. And of course you have the conflicts. For example, if you have the homeless guy, where the homeless guy killed the one lady because of a mobile phone that's worth like 50 euros. Or on the Alexanderplatz, where you have people trying to make use of that space or make that room their own, and we ordinary citizens have no safety anymore. So there's a conflict there, where you stage yourself in the public space, but the public has different plans for that. I have actually problems with that, to be honest with you. I wanted to get away from e-commerce as well, just like you, to come back to the topic. It's a great perception of you. You need your neighbors to take care of your Amazon parcel. Yeah, the unknown neighbors. It's Weber reloaded, but you get to know your anonymous neighbors because they took your Amazon parcels for you when you were at work. So that's very interesting. It's a little subject for urban sociology. Weber's principle of not knowing your neighbors, and now you have the Amazon parcels, and thus you get to know your neighbors through that. There were more questions here. Not anymore, no? Well, we talked about the function of the urban being shifted to the digital. Well, all the options of choice we have, do we still need the city for that? Or is that also shifting for the digital? You still need a public space to demonstrate, and also what you want politically, for example, to show it there. Well, I could do that over by online petitions, for example. But shitstorms, that's all. No, there's no impact to that. No, that does not really work. I remember these times when we thought, oh, when the internet, if it goes on like this, then no one will leave the house anymore and you don't need the open spaces anymore. But as we see right now, the inner protest that people have for thousands of reasons, about thousands of subjects, is still being brought to the city. And if you ask me, more than like 20, 30 years ago, I think there's a development. I'm not talking about flash mobs here. One question I still have, or more a comment here. Yeah, we used to think people are gonna end up in front of the computer, everybody one day. It's not only a demonstration, but the total eventization of the city. Everybody goes to places for, let's say, public viewing and so on. When we thought years ago everybody's got to stay at home, this is not happening. People are sitting in front of the cafes in their winter clothes, even though it's very cold. Cafe culture is really on the rise right now. I see more visible communication than we used to have it. Maybe it's part of the internet too, because people maybe think more, who can I meet where and when? There's also a city aspect, not so much a country aspect. Thank you so much for this comment. Any other comments on that? Otherwise, yes. Let's conclude this evening. And maybe a little word to end the evening with. Well, the translator wants to call it a day. Thank you so much to our guests. Let me take the option to invite you to our next two evenings here on the 5th of December here. We're going to continue. Another Tuesday. Today is Thursday. That was an exception for today. With the subject, narratives of the big city in word, image, and film. We're going to talk about the term metropolis and how it evolved. And the attraction of big cities is based on that. We're going to have a critical approach to that. And we're going to have a closer look on this metropolis narrative, how they're constructed, and how opinions of cities come into being, how they are distributed, redistributed, through what channels. And who writes these narratives? And a little bit like the urban society, we're going to talk about the different perspectives. And we have guests, Franziska Valery from the Hollerei, from the TU Delft in Belgium, and Rita Okshiko from the Society of Building Culture. Daniel Schwarz also is our guest here from the ETA Zurich in Switzerland, and we have a filmmaker too, and Birgit Zepanski. He is the author of Erzählte Stadt, Narrated City. And this evening shall be held in English and will be translated to German, if I'm right here. And on December 12th, on the 5th, we're going to work more on text. And on December 12th, we're going to deal with space, emancipation in room at the borders of architecture and spaces. It's going to be about models, stereotypes, and economic interests, how they manifest themselves in open spaces, and what role architecture and city planning have. And we're going to have guests, Gudrun Sack of the architectural body in Berlin. We have a sociologist, we have Martina Löw here, and Alexandra Staub from the Penn State College of Art, who is an expert in views on sexist emancipation and how they're transformed into buildings. I don't want to invite you to that, and our last evening of the year is also going to be held in English. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you had interesting insights here with us. I want to invite you something to eat, something to drink. Thank you, Helena Duderova, who co-curated, Michael Capati of the architectural body. Thank you so much. Peter Winter, my office partner. My team of Machen und Tun for the video, Peter Holsche, Jana and Kimberly for the assistance. Thank you so much. I wish you a pleasant evening. Get home soon and safe. Goodbye.